In the mid-1800s, audiences packed into a dimly lit theater across Europe and the United States to witness something they were told was unnatural. Something shocking, something almost not human. And at the center of it all stood a woman, small, poised, dressed elegantly, with a voice described as beautiful, and a face the world refused to understand. Her name was Julia Pastrana. Welcome back to Mealstounalivefor, the podcast where true crime, dark history, conspiracy, and food collide. I'm your host, and every week we serve up the stories that are as disturbing as they are fascinating, paired with a meal inspired by the chaos. So grab a plate, lock your doors, and let's dig in. Julia Pastrana was born in 1834 in the Mexican state of Sinaloa. From the moment she was born, she was seen as different. She had a rare genetic condition known as hypertrichosis, which caused excessive hair growth all over her entire body and face. She also had features associated with gingival hyperplasia, which affected the shape of her jaw and lips. At the time, there was no medical understanding of conditions like this. There was only fear and curiosity. As a child, Julia was reportedly taken from her mother and brought into the household of a regional governor. Accounts vary on how exactly this happened, but what's clear is this. From very early on, her life was shaped by other people's control. Eventually, she was sold into exhibition, put on display, advertised as something between human and animal. But what those advertisements left out was who Julia actually was. She was intelligent. She spoke multiple languages. She sang. She danced. She had presence. People who had met her often described her as kind, articulate, and far more refined than the crowds who came to stare at her. But none of that mattered to the people who profited from her. Because in the 19th century, there was an industry built around spectacle, and Julia Pastrana became one of its most famous attractions. She toured extensively throughout Europe and the United States, performing in what was known as freak shows. Promoters gave her names like the Bear Woman or the Ape Woman. They wrote exaggerated, often fabricated stories about her origins. They turned her into something mythical, something less than human. And audiences came in droves. What makes her story even more disturbing is what happened behind the scenes. Her manager, a man named Theodore Lent, eventually married her. At first glance, it might seem like a strange kind of rescue, a man who saw beyond her appearance, a relationship built on something deeper. But that's not what it was. Lent saw Julia as an asset, something he could control completely, and marriage gave him exactly that. He dictated her performances, her schedule, her public image, even her personal life. And then in 1860, Julia became pregnant. While on tour in Moscow, she gave birth to a son, and the child inherited her condition. He lived for only a few days. Julia died shortly after, just 26 years old. And if the story ended there, it would already be tragic enough. But it didn't. Because Theodore Lent made a decision that turned tragedy into something far darker. He had both Julia's body and their infant son's body preserved, taxidermied, and then he put them back on display. Think about that. She had spent her entire life being exhibited, controlled, reduced to something for other people to consume. And even in death, that didn't stop. Lent toured their bodies across Europe, continuing to profit from them long after Julia was gone. Eventually, the bodies changed hands multiple times. Exhibited, stored, lost, rediscovered. At one point, Julia's remains were even stolen, passed between collectors, treated as an object rather than a person. For over 150 years, she was never truly laid to rest. It wasn't until 2013 that Julia Pastrana was finally returned to Mexico. She was buried in her home country in a ceremony that acknowledged her humanity for perhaps the first time since her death. That's what makes her story so difficult to sit with, because it forces you to look at something uncomfortable. Julia Pastrana wasn't a monster. She wasn't a curiosity. She wasn't something to be feared. She was a woman who was intelligent, talented, and by many accounts, deeply kind. But the world around her refused to see that. Instead, it turned her into something else, something easier to exploit. And in doing that, it revealed far more about society than it ever did about her. Because the real horror story in Julia's story isn't her condition, it's what people chose to do with it. The way they packaged it, sold it, consumed it, and the fact that even after her death, they didn't stop. There's a tendency to look at stories like this and think of them as part of a different time, a darker past, something we've moved beyond. But Julia's story lingers because it asks a question that still matters. How do we treat people who are different? Do we try to understand them, or do we turn them into something easier to categorize, something easier to distance ourselves from? Julia Pastrana never got to choose how the world saw her, but today we get to choose how we remember her. Not a spectacle, not a headline, but as a person, someone who deserved far more than the life she was given, and far more than what happened to her after it ended. Thanks for listening, guys. I hope you enjoyed this short story. I definitely enjoyed the Mexican empanadas, and I will see you guys on the next one. Bye.